Last week, thousands of students across the province of Alberta walked out of their classrooms at 9:30 in the morning in order to protest some changes that the UCP have said they're going to make to the protections that are afforded to GSAs or gay-straight alliances. Now, this is a really complex issue. There's a lot of emotion behind it. So in order to kind of unpack it and begin to understand it, there's four basic questions that we really need to answer. The first question is, fundamentally, what are GSAs? The second question is, what is Bill 24? The third question that we need to answer is, why do people want these changes made? Why do they want to get rid of Bill 24? And the fourth question is, what is actually going to change? So the first question, let's go to, what are GSAs? Fundamentally, what GSAs are is they're school clubs that are run by students but supervised by somebody provided by the school. And they came about because kids in high school started to realize that LGBTQ youth were at significantly higher risk of having some really terrible things happen to them. So some of the terrible things that can happen to these kids, first of all, LGBTQ youth are 8 times more likely to try to commit suicide than their heterosexual counterparts. 1 in 3 homeless kids identify as LGBTQ, and of those kids, the vast majority of them identify the reason why they're homeless as because they were rejected by their families. This all boils down to the fact that while the vast majority of parents out there are very supportive of their kids and they do provide positive environments for their kids, there are some parents that just don't. And the reality, the hard reality that we gotta own is the fact that there are parents who kick their kids out of their homes because they've decided to come out to them. And for kids who come out when they're in high school or in junior high, that's an incredibly vulnerable time for them, and it ends up leading to all kinds of additional trauma that they experience on the streets. To be clear, GSAs are just clubs. There's no curriculum, there's no sort of agenda that's being advanced. And in fact, from what I've heard anecdotally, the vast majority of conversations that happen at GSAs don't have anything to do specifically with LGBTQ issues. More than anything, they're a safe place where these kids can go to get some support from other kids who want to actually support them. And for a kid who's going through the kind of challenges that we just talked about, that support can be absolutely life-saving. The next question that we need to answer is, what is Bill 24? So Bill 24 was introduced as a bill that was designed to create some framework and some rules for how GSAs are created and how they go about their business. There's a couple of main things that you have to know about Bill 24. First of all, it states that if a kid requests that a GSA get started at a school and that school doesn't have one, that request has to be approved immediately by the principal. Next thing that it does is it says that when that request comes in, the principal has to find as quickly as possible an adult that can supervise the GSA meetings. It doesn't run them, it's just there as a supervisory capacity, no different than a chaperone at a dance. But there has to be an adult provided that can supervise those GSA meetings. The next thing that it does is it provides some framework in regards to making sure that only the principal of that school can communicate to the parents that a GSA has been started. And that's all that the principal is allowed to communicate. So it makes sure that which kids are going to this GSA isn't reported back to anyone. It gives the kids some privacy if they need it. Now again, I want to be really clear. If a parent has a strong relationship with their kid, I can't see any reason why a kid wouldn't be comfortable telling their parents about that. If the kid isn't comfortable telling their parents about it, there's a reason for that. So that's why this framework exists. The other big thing that Bill 24 did is it made it clear that if there were schools that chose not to follow this regulation, the Minister of Education had the ability to put some penalties in place to make sure that if a school chose, for whatever reason, not to be a part of this process, they would have some penalties to face. This brings us to our next question, which is, why do people have problems with Bill 24, or why do people even have problems with GSAs? And there's really only a couple of answers for that one. The first one, overwhelmingly, is misinformation. There's been a lot of stories that have been reported on or repeated in social media that simply aren't true. One of the big ones that we hear a lot about is the kid who was taken off of school property while he was at a GSA. Well, let's be absolutely clear here. That's not a GSA problem. That's a violation of every school security protocol that I've ever heard about. And I got kids that go to a young school. It would be kidnapping for somebody to take a child off of school grounds without their parents' permission. And that rule extends and covers GSAs. So that story is simply not true. And in fact, the person who was involved in this story came forward to the media about a month ago and said, whoa, 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 that's not what happened. Unfortunately, the version that was initially reported still gets repeated, and it makes people afraid. The second problem that we have is people think that there are non-qualified staff or people who could just wander in off the street who could be leading these GSAs. Again, that's patently not true. Volunteering to lead a GSA is no different than a parent or a guardian or anybody else volunteering to work in a child's classroom. Here in Calgary, if you want to volunteer to work in a kid's classroom, you have to get a security check. There's a bunch of other things that you have to do, and you have to report when you come and go. It's not just some random person showing up and leading the organization. It's simply not true. One of the biggest concerns that people have, though, about GSAs is there's the belief that if a child was to be at risk, if they were in significant distress, that a teacher wouldn't be able to elevate that to the proper authorities and that kid would just somehow fall through the cracks. The reality is that's simply not true. Ask any teacher, they'll tell you if they believe that a kid's at risk, they have a legal responsibility to report that, and Bill 24 doesn't override that. If a kid's suicidal, a teacher has a responsibility to report that. That hasn't changed. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems that we have is that because a lot of these misleading stories have been repeated and repeated and repeated, people, especially people in high places, have a tendency of unfortunately not only believing them, but repeating them. We saw this at the candidates debate that I was involved in over at the Genesis Center when I tried to correct one of the other candidates and explain that their interpretation of how GSAs work simply wasn't correct. If a child's in distress, a teacher can report that. This candidate refused to believe that. And in fact, I'm going to play a clip in just a second here where you'll see that she says, as I'm offering the correct information, I don't believe that, I don't believe that. Here's that clip. To be absolutely clear, what Rajan just said is not true. If a teacher believes that a child is at risk, they have a responsibility under law to report that. This GSA piece has nothing to do with that. That's false information. You go ask any teacher, they'll tell you different.
I don't think that's true. That's not
Secondly, in regards to the pipeline.
That is not true.
To give you an idea of how serious this can get when this sort of misinformation is repeated and repeated and people start to believe it, that candidate is now the MLA for Calgary Northeast, and she's also the Minister for Community and Social Services. This is the ministry that is in large part going to be responsible for reaching out to LGBTQ kids that are on the street that have had to deal with these problems. When these lies get repeated, they turn into very real problems and they put kids at risk. Now, one of the other pieces of this conversation that gets a little bit awkward, well, a lot awkward actually, is the fact that when we're talking about the difficulties getting GSAs started, we're not so much talking about the public school system, we're talking about private schools. And in particularly, we're talking about faith-based private schools. And in fact, if you take a look at the names that are listed on a current lawsuit trying to get the Bill 24 revoked, most of those schools are faith-based schools. I want to be really clear. I don't have a problem with faith-based education. I never have. I never will. I was raised in a faith-based home, and I absolutely believe that people who live faith-based lives can get a lot of comfort and they can get a lot of direction from their faith. I don't have a problem with people and their faith. But what I do have a problem with is when kids, and we've shown, the science is in, there's an organic component to how people fit on the LGBTQ spectrum. When kids don't have access to supports that acknowledge that, those kids are at risk. And particularly when we're talking about kids in faith-based schools who have parents who aren't accepting of them, those are the kids who are most at risk for homelessness and suicide and depression and all of the other horrible things that Bill 24 is trying to protect against. So the last question that we have to answer is, what's going to change when the UCP inevitably roll back Bill 24 and remove a lot of the protections that have been provided to these GSAs? Well, one of the things that the UCP likes to say over and over again is that Alberta will still have the strongest anti-bullying protection in place for kids in schools. That's actually a little bit arguable because if you take a look at what the actual laws will be, BC will edge us out a little bit. We'll be better than the rest of the country, but the reality is that a rollback of rights is still a rollback of rights, and that's what these kids are so upset about. So functionally what we're going to look at is there's not going to be any sort of a time limit that's required for how long it takes for a GSA to be established after a student requests it. That means that if a student requests a GSA, that principal can potentially drag their feet for as long as they want to before they actually set up the GSA. The next thing that's going to happen is that private schools are going to be exempt from all of this legislation. So given that faith-based schools are some of the schools that have some of the biggest challenges with this issue, not having them be involved in a mandatory program to have GSAs exist to get these kids the protections that we know they need is dangerous. And that's really the only word for it. The third thing that comes into place is that there will not be any guidelines in regards to what sort of privacy rules teachers need to follow when they're navigating these kids and their involvement in GSAs. And to give you an idea of how serious that actually is, one of the things that happened that prompted the creation of Bill 24 is the fact that the Alberta Teachers Association, which is the largest association of teachers in our province, said, look, we do not want the power to be able to out LGBTQ kids. We want that taken away. We don't want anything to do with it. One can't help but wonder if Jason Kenney really believes that teachers are the ones to be trusted and it's their discretion that should determine whether or not parents are informed as to their kids' involvement in GSAs. If they've spoken in a unified voice in their association and said, we want nothing to do with this, why won't he listen? So that's pretty much it for our first little episode of the breakdown. We're going to try to get some title credits worked out somewhere down the road. Might even get some theme music. We'll see what happens there. But there's a lot of different topics that I still want to cover. And in particular, if there's any topics that you want to see discussed, I'd love to hear from you. Some of the topics that we're looking at, definitely going to be talking about the carbon tax in the next video because there's been some really interesting developments there. Definitely going to be talking about TMX and the status of it as a pipeline right now. And then one of the big issues that just popped up today, we're going to be talking about the UCP efforts to be able to allow hate speech on post-secondary institutions, which is actually in contravention of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. So that's going to be fun. If you have any questions, love to hear from you. Thanks.